This is the South Asia Solutions presentation. Recapping what we've done so far in the course, we've looked at a whole bunch of different solutions to grave world problems. We've talked about non-governmental organizations or NGOs, international governmental organizations. We've looked into fair trade, microfinance. We've contrasted holistic development with single solution development. And in the next region module, we're going to talk a little bit about disaster relief. In the Islamic Empire, we did something that is really the beginning of what I want to talk about for this particular region module. We looked at single solution versus holistic development, and then we talked a little bit about how each of them measures their effectiveness and what they do. And I made the argument back then that single solution was a little bit more akin to quantitative measures, while holistic was a little bit more akin to qualitative measures. And that, to some extent, made it a little bit easier to look at single solution solutions because, you're able to look at the numbers a little bit more easily than you are the qualitative data. But now what I want to do is ask the question, how do we know which organizations and which methods really are the best? Not just in terms of how these organizations report what they do. And that's actually a pretty difficult question. This question really comes out of a new movement that we're seeing more and more of in the development world called effective altruism. Effective altruism argues that we really need to be asking tough questions about what our money does. Not just money that we contribute to charitable organizations, but also to government spending as well. Effective altruism often asks, can dollars spent translate directly into lives saved, and how can we save the most lives as efficiently as possible so that we're able to do the very most good? Now, there are a couple of ways to look at this, and the way that's most common is to look at these issues of efficiency and transparency, which we already did a little bit in this course by looking at Charity Navigator. You may remember this website that ranks each of the organizations that we've been talking about, or at least many of the organizations that we've been talking about, and gives them a 4-star rating or a 3-star rating. These ratings are generally based on measures such as how much of the money that is donated to an organization goes directly to the programs that it's doing versus how much goes to administration. Another thing that's often measured is how much are executives paid in an organization. And then a third thing that's often measured is how clear are the accounting practices of that organization so we can really see transparently what that organization is doing. All of these measures are really important measures and help us to understand at least some aspects of what an organization does. Now, there are some critiques of it. For example, one size doesn't fit all, and it turns out that some organizations get a lot of grant money and they can turn that directly into program. They don't have to raise their own money, in part because maybe they're doing someone else's bidding, and so they might not be able to be as innovative as an organization that's raising its own money is. And executives, it could be argued, can bring a lot to an organization. If you have a highly paid executive, that person might be a really great executive, and they might be able to really help that organization meet its goals much better than someone who's only poorly paid and might not be the very best candidate for the job. So oftentimes, these sorts of measures of efficiency and transparency are useful, but they don't tell everything, and they also often don't go very deep. That's where measuring effectiveness comes in. And again, we briefly talked about this when we looked at an organization called Give Well, which I'd like you to look at a little bit after you complete this. Measuring effectiveness asks the questions that are really sort of tough for an organization. Does the program do exactly what it's supposed to be doing? If it's supposed to alleviate hunger, are people less hungry? If it's trying to reduce malaria, are there fewer cases of malaria? And then it looks very, very closely at how organizations are measuring their outcomes and how effective they are in doing what they're doing. In other words, are they really efficient? And if I make a $1 donation to one organization, can it do more with that dollar than what another organization might be able to do? Now, there have been critiques of this as well, that sometimes they're too quantitative and they miss some of the really big picture items. But it's a really important conversation to have. Is an organization effective, and how are we assessing that effectiveness? A few final thoughts, because this is obviously something that's going to take you a little bit of time to think about and dig into as well. Let's remember that effectiveness probably shouldn't just be measured with a sort of external thing like how many lives are we saving, or how many bed nets are we putting up, or how much hunger are we stopping. Remember that some organizations try to solve root causes, and that can in many ways be much more effective than fixing symptoms. And a great example of this actually is in HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Back when HIV and AIDS was a much more problematic plague than it is right now, and it's still pretty bad in sub-Saharan Africa, there was a huge debate in the development world about whether money should be going into prevention or into extending people's lives who already had the disease. And it was pretty popular to argue to get antiretroviral medicines to people who had the disease to extend their life and reduce their suffering. But there were a number of people in the development world who argued that if you can prevent the transmission of the disease, it's actually much cheaper and it saves more lives in the long run. So that's a good argument of root causes versus actually fixing the symptoms of something. And then another thing I'd like you to think a little bit about is once you start really thinking about effectiveness, you can find yourself in a little bit of a rabbit hole, as I've set up here in the presentation. And what I mean by that is, if you start asking, how many lives can I save with $1? It's going to necessarily get you thinking a little bit, what am I doing with money that might not be effective at all, that might be pretty selfish, focused on me as opposed to other people? And shouldn't I be spending that money more effectively than I am? And before you know it, you can find yourself really questioning what you are doing with your life and how much money you should be spending on luxury goods and things like that. And that's another really important thing to explore and spend a little bit of time thinking about.